In a quiet medieval kingdom nestled between golden hills and ancient forests, there was a great castle that had stood for 1,000 years. But inside that castle lived a king who had forgotten how to trust anyone at all. His name was King Alderon, and he had ruled his kingdom alone for decades with cold eyes and a heavy heart. He dismissed his advisors one by one, believing every man around him had hidden motives. He threw loyal noblemen into dungeons on nothing more than a whisper of suspicion. And so the great king sat on his throne, surrounded by gold and power, yet completely and far below the castle walls, in the poorest corner of the village, lived a young boy named Eli. Eli had nothing to his name but a torn shirt, a small leather satchel, and the most honest eyes anyone had ever seen. Every morning he woke before sunrise and walked through the muddy village, helping anyone who needed it without being asked. One cold gray morning, Eli was walking near the edge of the forest when he spotted something unexpected tied to a tree. It was a horse draped in royal cloth bearing the golden crest of the king. Eli looked around and saw no one, so he carefully untied the horse and began leading it back toward the castle. The villagers stopped and stared as the small barefoot boy walked calmly through the market holding the reins of a royal horse. When Eli reached the castle gates, the armored guards looked down at him with wide eyes, unable to believe what they were seeing. The guards took the horse and brought Eli inside the cold stone corridors of the castle. And there at the end of the great hall, sitting high on his throne, was King Alderon, staring down at the small boy with cold, suspicious eyes. Eli did not tremble, and he did not bow his head. He simply looked up at the king with calm, steady, honest eyes. The king narrowed his gaze and leaned forward, studying the boy's face, searching for a lie that was not there. He asked the boy why he had returned the horse when he could have simply kept it and walked away. And Eli answered without hesitation, because it was not mine to keep. Those 6 words hit the old king like a stone, and for the first time in many years he did not know what to say. He stared at the boy for a long moment, then quietly ordered his guards to bring him food and clean clothes. That night the king sat alone in his chamber, thinking about the small barefoot boy who had returned what was not his. The next morning the king summoned Eli back to the throne room and asked him a single question. He asked Eli what he wanted in return for bringing back the royal horse. Eli looked at the king and said, "I want nothing. Your Majesty, I only did what was right." The king stood up slowly and walked down from his throne until he was standing directly in front of the boy. He studied Eli's face once more, searching for greed or cunning, but found only honesty looking back at him. For the first time in decades, the king smiled a small, quiet smile that no one in the court had ever seen before. He told Eli that he would stay in the castle and learn alongside the royal scholars in the great library. Eli walked through the towering doors of the royal library and stood completely still, staring at thousands of ancient books and scrolls. Every evening, the king himself would sit beside Eli and teach him to read from the oldest scrolls in the kingdom. Day by day, something was changing inside the old king, and the coldness that had lived in his eyes for so long was slowly melting away. But not everyone in the castle was pleased to see the poor village boy walking freely through the royal halls. The king's advisors whispered among themselves, saying the boy was dangerous and that the king had lost his senses. One night the king walked silently through the corridor and overheard his most trusted advisor plotting to send Eli away forever. The king stood behind the stone pillar listening and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, and that was betrayal. The next morning he called every advisor and guard into the throne room and silenced them all with a single look. He told them that the only person in this castle who had ever shown him true loyalty was a barefoot boy with nothing to his name. And then he turned to Eli and placed a golden medallion around the boy's neck in front of every man in the room. The golden medallion caught the torchlight and glowed warmly against Eli's chest as every man in the room watched in silence. From that day forward, no one in the castle dared to speak a word against the boy who had walked in barefoot from the village. Eli continued to learn every single day, reading ancient scrolls and listening carefully to everything the king taught him. And the king continued to walk through his village not from his high castle window but on the ground among his own people. He spoke to the old men sitting outside their stone homes and listened to the young boys playing in the muddy streets. For the first time in his long reign, the people of the kingdom saw their king not as a distant shadow but as a real man. And it was Eli who had made that possible with nothing more than an honest pair of eyes and 6 simple words. One evening as the sun was setting over the kingdom, the king called Eli to the highest tower of the castle. They stood together looking out over the golden fields. the quiet village and the ancient forest stretching far into the distance. The king placed his hand on Eli's shoulder and said, "You taught an old man something that all his years of ruling never could." Eli looked up at the king and asked, "What did I teach you, your majesty?" And the king looked out at his kingdom and said, "You taught me that trust is not something you demand, it is something you earn." The two of them stood in silence as the last light of the sun disappeared behind the golden hills. Years passed, and Eli grew from a barefoot village boy into a wise and respected young man known throughout the kingdom. And King Alderaan ruled with a warmth and openness that his people had never seen before and never forgot. The dungeons that had once been filled with falsely accused men were emptied, and the kingdom breathed freely again. People in distant lands heard stories of the great king who had been changed by a poor boy with an honest heart, and those who heard the story always asked the same question: what does it take to change a man who has everything? The answer was always the same: it takes someone who wants nothing and gives everything. And somewhere in that kingdom, a boy who once walked barefoot through muddy streets smiled and knew that doing what was right had been enough.